We are delighted to welcome author Margaret Renkl as our guest for the Summer Solstice Plant Circle, as she sets an example for care and explores our relationship to the feathered and to the leafy world. And you might know Margaret best as a frequent contributor for 9 years to the New York Times as a regular opinion columnist. And man, I was delighted to know that there was room for nature and wonder in the usually grim news landscape. And I've always looked forward to these gems, which remind us that the news can and I think should include the goings on of our more than human neighbors as well as ourselves. Margaret is also celebrated as a best-selling author who has twice received the Southern Book Prize. Her books include Late Migration and The Comfort of Crows, which I love the way it is described as both a love letter and an elegy. It balances the wonder of backyard ecosystems with the sobering realities of climate change and species loss. And I love to dip into the comfort of crows, Margaret. It really does bring comfort. And there's usually an idea or an image that sticks to me like a burdock um, in the best way. It really stays with me. And then in your work, Leaf, Cloud, Crow, A Backyard Journal, one review captures its essence like this. I urge you all to go explore. If you despair at the loss of ecosystems and the damage we have done to the wild world, Renkel's words and the lessons she imparts are a balm for those who wish to do better, see better, and of course, write better. Her particular backyard is in Nashville, Tennessee, which is full of birds and bugs and plants and wildlife, a place that she has intentionally created for their well being. And we're so excited to talk with Margaret today about all of this and especially about your newest book, your debut children's picture book called The Weedy Garden. And in closing of our introduction, I want to say that Margaret, for me, embodies Mary Oliver's prescription when she says life in 3 steps, instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Thank you for telling us about it, Margaret. And thank you for joining us at Plant Baby Plant. It's a deep honor to speak with you.
Robin, the honor is all mine. I'm just speaking of astonishment. I am astonished to be in your presence, even your digital presence.
Aren't we lucky? We should make that a real physical presence and go look at birds and bugs together
I
sometime.
would love that. I would love
Yeah.
that. I'll bring my notebook.
Well, when we are gathering around Plant Baby Plant, a reminder to all our listeners that Plant Baby Plant aims to inspire and encourage hands in the dirt and other direct actions for regeneration, for protection. And your books are so full of these really practical ways that you have chosen to interact with the living world, making habitat. I especially like the way that you talk about removing perils for wildlife, and it models this really compassionate relationship with the natural world. And could you tell us a little bit about where did that orientation come from for you? Who were your teachers in this approach to relationship with the living world?
I think my teachers were the toads and the blue jays and the pine trees in lower Alabama when I was a child in the 60s and 70s. In those days, people didn't exactly supervise their children, and they certainly didn't entertain them. And so my brother and I, my brother, the Billy Renkl, who is an artist and an illustrator, and whose work appears in most of my books, it was on the buddy system. We were allowed to go anywhere our little feet could take us, and stay as long as we liked. We just came home when we were hungry, and where we liked to be was the fields and the woods around our house in Lower Alabama or on our grandparents' farm. And it's I think children are born with that sense of curiosity. I'm watching this again with I watched it with my children. I'm watching it again with my oldest grandchild who just says bee anytime anything flies by. And then we talk about that's a ladybug, that's a mayfly, that's a grasshopper. And so, when you marry, I guess, inborn curiosity with a landscape that's alive, then you come away with a sense of neighborliness. These are your neighbors, these are your friends. And I don't think we all know that small children just animate everything, hello, hubcap. But when they're actually animate, it's a different, a special kind of relationship. So that was just my orientation to the world all the way through my childhood and my older youth. But when I got to college, my senior year, my last quarter, I took an environmental biology class, and it was very far afield from my usual English, philosophy, Latin, history program of study. And it was the first time I understood that my love for the natural world, the world that has always been my solace and my comfort in in times of struggle, that world was actually very deeply imperiled, and I had not understood that before then. So then from then on, from 22, I walked side by side with grief and love. And I think when those feelings are so clear and so constant, then the very next step is always, what can I do? What can I do?
Well, you know, I love this relationship between your training and your practice as a feral child, right? Um, as a journalist, as a writer, as a thinker, and also as fluent in biology. That's so clear in your writing that you have the vocabulary that spans all of that, which makes, I think, your writing so inviting. And Margaret, your question, your remark about what can I do is at the heart again of Plant Baby Plant, because Plant Baby Plant really has emerged out of this impassioned question that we get from readers, I'm sure you do too, of what can I do? Particularly in this political moment, what can I do in resistance to the dismantling of environmental protections as the living world just frays at the edges? And one of the ways that we try to answer that is to say, well, let's together raise a garden and raise a ruckus, thinking that we have not only to have direct action for healing land, but also acts of resistance. And I'd love to hear what connection you might see, if any, between land care and resistance. Is the kind of habitat care and the knowledge sharing that you do as a writer and a practitioner, is that in some way an act of resistance?
I'm not a marcher, Robin. I'm uneasy in crowds. I always feel like crowds are just one click away from throwing rocks. And of course these days gathering in crowds invites a kind of danger. But I do feel that talking and writing are weapons in their own right. To us, I would rather be the kind of writer or the kind of speaker who gently persuades than one who chants uh, or petitions. And it's not that I don't wish I were more like those people. I am so grateful to them. And my husband goes to every one of those, the women's marches and the No Kings rallies. I mean, I'm grateful for the people who do see that as part of their mission, but it is difficult for me. And so I'd rather write. I'd rather write and I'd rather talk and I'd rather put a few little signs around the edges of my yard. We are on a corner lot, and so I have a sign from the Xerxes Society that says this garden is protected from pesticides for pollinators, and it has a QR code that leads to the Xerxes Society for Invertebrate Conservation's website and explains more about how pesticides are problems for the pollinators and other insects. And then I have another sign on the other side of the yard that explains why I leave the leaves. And then I have another sign that says it's a certified wildlife habitat. And I just think that these kinds of things demonstrating that this way of being is viable, but more that it is, I mean, it's beautiful. I think it's beautiful. I don't know if my eyes have been tuned a different way than others' eyes, but I look at these sterile yards of boxwoods and crepe myrtles and turf grass, and they look sterile to me. There's no living thing in sight. And so, I think that planting a garden that others can see and perhaps hope to emulate, and then having some information either in a newspaper or in a book or on a blog or in some sort of comment section of one of those things is maybe a gentler and slower way of resistance, but I think it still works as resistance. And also, you mentioned the Weedy Garden, my picture book. I do have this secret feeling that I might be deputizing all the second graders of America to this mission. And I have a little neighbor his mom texts me, "Oh, Walter made us plant a pollinator garden, and we have milkweed and black-eyed Susans and coneflower, but we couldn't find any trumpet vine." And I said, "Good news, you have trumpet vine growing up a light pole at the corner of your yard." And then I get these periodic updates from Walter, who's 3, about all the things that he wants to do in their yard because his mom has read The Weedy Garden to him. So I hope this keeps happening, slowly. I'm patient.
Oh, I love that. And to me, that is the heart of resistance, right? You're showing another way. And not just keeping that to yourself, but sharing it with others, to seed the change that we want in the world. Yeah, yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Um, that connects to a question that I wanted to ask about one of your New York Times columns. Uh, to nurture nature, neglect your lawn. And I love that. It's really at the heart of so much of our work where you write. We are not powerless. We can train our eyes to see the perfect lawn for what it is, a field of poison. And when we remember, as you share with us, that lawns are, 40 to 50 million acres across the United States, the changes that we make in our so-called residential or domestic landscapes really matter. And out of your experience with your neighbors, with your sign, I'd like to hear also about your yard. What is like the small first step that someone who has a lawn, who has been persuaded by you to think, no, I do not want a field of poison in my neighborhood. Where do you start? What are some recommendations that you might offer to folks?
I think that's such a good question. Although I know you know the answer better than I do. I just think that the where to start is often where we get in our own way because the discourse online can be so strident and so full of vitriol that people can come away from this movement, loose as it might be, thinking that if they can't do everything, there is no point in doing anything. And that's our real struggle is to convince people that, you know what, if you love daffodils, it's okay to love daffodils. If your mother planted that patch of daylilies, as long as you're keeping it under control, you're not letting it spread into the ditches and the wild spaces, you can have that too. It isn't a matter of giving up everything you love, especially the things that you love that have are part of your own human heritage. I like to tell my neighbors, not my literal neighbors, because they're not really much for this movement, but the people who say, I planted a garden and I got all these things, but I got a text yesterday. My one downfall is that I couldn't resist the lilies. And I'm like, you know what? Yes, we do have native lilies that have a better place in our landscapes. But if you love that lily, you're a human being. You're part of the natural world, and you can have what you want as long as it's in proportion. And that's where I think we might get mixed up. Where to start means you're just at the beginning of this journey. You don't have to do it all, and you don't have to do it all at once. So, yes, it's fine. I read an article in the Times a year or so ago about somebody who hired a native plant landscaping specialist, and they killed everything, all the turf grass, and started over. But it was a $30,000 operation, and not everybody has that kind of startup fund, to say the least, or the strong back, or the time. So I always say start by stopping. Start by giving up the fertilizer that ends up washing into our waterways and causing algae bloom into, our creeks and rivers. Give up, and which, by the way, is made of fossil fuels. Give up the sprays you put on the yard to kill the insects. People are terrified of ticks. I understand that. But there are ways to avoid ticks without poisoning every other crawling thing in the yard. Give up the Roundup to make it easier to weed. You'll feel happier if you get down in the dirt and you let those microbes that are in the soil waft up and stimulate the serotonin in your brain. You just will be a happier person. And it's okay if it gets a little weedy in places. Those kinds of things, I think, when you stop poisoning, when you stop fertilizing, when you stop spraying anything into the trees, into the soil, into the shrubbery, you have the wild world move in. And then the natural next step is to say, oh, I didn't know I had bluebirds. Oh, I didn't know I had uh, rose-breasted grosbeaks coming through every May. What can I do? What can I plant? What can I do to help do a little more? And then in stages, and it expands. And I think that because that's how it worked for me. That's how it worked for me. Not just loving, but moving from love to helping.
Exactly. Exactly. And the rewards are, well, the rewards feel oftentimes so magical. I was just talking to someone the other day who had rewilded their yard with the same careful and patient, gradual steps that you're talking about. And she said on a summer night when she walks through her neighborhood, it's dark, 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 and then they get to her lawn, and there's an explosion of fireflies. And to her, that's her sign. That's her sign on the corner, right? To say, look what happens when you invite life to return.
And
So
often, people do notice that. We had a neighbor one time who asked, Why do you have lightning bugs? We don't have any. Nobody else has any. And my husband Haywood, he just said, well, we don't spray and we leave our leaves. So they have, you know, lightning bugs. You're, you're, we call them lightning bugs down here, fireflies in
Uh-huh.
other parts of the country. They spend so much of their time as larvae, as glowworms in the leaf litter. And if they don't have leaves, then you can't, if you don't have, you know, baby fireflies growing in your leaves, you don't have fireflies the next summer.
Yeah, well said. But to include not only lightning bugs, but whooping cranes. I want to reference your last column in the New York Times when you were witnessing the tentative resurgence of an iconic endangered species. And you wrote, let me just read a tad of this because I love it so much. In that instance, I learned that I didn't need to see Wheeler's whooping cranes out of fear that I'd otherwise miss my chance. I needed to see them to remember what my own species is capable of. To see a whooping crane in the wild is to be reminded that we nearly killed something miraculous. And then, almost unbelievably, we didn't. Against all evidence to the contrary, we are as much the healing species as the murdering one. And oh, that's one of those things that sticks to me like a burdock, Margaret. That it's it's such a poignant observation. And this notion that humans can be a healing species, that we can be, as we say in Potawatomi, that we could be medicine for the land, is the essence that really underlies the effort of Plant Baby Plant and everyone in this movement. It's the dual responsibility both to restore and to restory, to change that narrative of who we human beings can be in the world. So as a such a gifted and important writer, could you speak a little bit about this need to restory, to shift the cultural narrative away from murderers to healers? That's um, so powerful.
Well, I think as a species, I think we've probably always been both. Um, we just live now in an age where if it bleeds, it leads. So that ever since we had mass media, we've had we've been bombarded with stories of the harm human beings have inflicted upon one another and upon the living earth. And I there's no doubt that those things are true. It's not that they are untrue. It's not even that they have been blown out of proportion, but they've been put in a place, they are placed in the lead in a way that makes us um, unconsciously believe that that's the most important thing about us as a species, when it's the part we have always, from the time we've had written language at least, sought to overcome in ourselves. We are poets. We are artists who draw on cave walls, poets who remember our stories by passing them down because we have no written language. It's as much a part of us as the other side, the more visible side is. And I think one reason we need to tell the stories of the whooping cranes, and not just the whooping cranes, but the bald eagles and the peregrine falcons and the American alligator and the Tennessee coneflower, because these are stories of human beings just like us who have recognized something glorious that was failing, struggling because of us, and made the effort by telling those stories to other people, who told them to other people, who reached senators and representatives. And eventually, the story becomes stronger. The story of resistance, but the story of healing, it becomes stronger than the story of violence. I think we have always been a storytelling species. We look at our great religious teachers across the millennia, and they taught by parables. They taught by stories, and that's because a story seeps into us, and we remember it. We remember it, um, and when we remember it, we are more moved to act on it. It's not a headline we scan. It's a story that moves into us and takes root, I think. I don't think little Walter in my neighborhood is going to grow up to spray his yard with poison. I think that his garden has taken root, and it's a quiet thing his mom has done, but it will, I think, save him and save us in the end.
Yes. And that notion of it's a quiet thing is so powerful, I think, and reminds me of um, a conversation that a written conversation that I heard about in your decision to step away from the writing for the New York Times in this moment when I read your words on this quiet voice. Let me find them in my notes here. There we are. You wrote, in a burning world like this, there is less and less room for the quiet voice of a generalist who dislikes arguments that land like a two by four across the brow. There is less room, too, for editors who encourage that kind of writing. And this is this notion of the quiet, patient voice that tells the story, that changes the story, that plants those seeds. I'd be really interested if there's more you'd like to say about the power of the quiet voice in seeding cultural change.
That's so interesting, Robin. Nobody's ever asked me that before. I have to think about this for a moment. There's an essay by Wendell Berry, the great agrarian poet from Kentucky, who also writes novels and essays, and who actually does lead protests, and he has camped out in the governor's office in protest of surface mining, mountaintop removal mining, and and he wrote this essay. I think it was maybe 1980, maybe earlier than that, about resistance and about movements. And he was writing in response to a book of poetry about the Vietnam War and the need to resist um, evil actions on the part of a government that is funded by and speaks for its people. And he made a point that I think I had never really considered. He said that these movements, if you expect change to come immediately or even within your lifetime, you're you're going to be gravely disappointed. That isn't how long-term lasting change has ever worked. People plant the seeds generations before somebody else sees the flowering. And I that helped me because it does sometimes feel like futile action. Like I'm I'm pushing that stone up the hill like Sisyphus. I'm, tilting at windmills. It and yet to understand that it's part of a generational thing gives me comfort. I don't have to do it all in my own yard, and I don't have to do it all in the world. I just have to keep doing what I think is best, and as much because it offers me comfort as because I think it makes a difference. Every time one of my neighbors cuts down a tree, I plant another tree. And I think it's like are those equivalent actions? Is my little native dogwood sapling gonna replace a 200-year-old magnolia that's in the way of of a McMansion? No, it's not. But it's going to make me feel better, and it is going to provide sustenance for my displaced wild neighbors. So I think quiet is okay. Slow, quiet, that's okay. It's
Yeah.
not, it's not the only thing, as Wendell Berry has demonstrated in both his own writing and in his life. But collectively, it's a whole lot.
Yeah. Yes, and that notion of in response to that tree being cut, let's say, that we can take the reciprocal action to say, well, I'll plant more, without the expectation of material equivalence, but it changes the landscape, doesn't it? It changes the culture through those acts of what is truly creative resistance, regenerative kind of resistance. Helps to change the story and change the land.
And I think, one of the great benefits of movements like Plant Baby Plant and Homegrown National Park and Wild Ones, these organizations and these collectives, is that when we do these things together, when we each have one. It's a fragmented landscape, but a lot of these little creatures can fly. A lot of them can travel far distances on rainy nights. And um and we are creating for them corridors, even if we can't create national parks. It matters. It
Yeah,
does.
I know. And when people think, well, it doesn't matter, you say, well, it really matters to those beetles. It
Yes.
really matters to those lightning bugs. And it matters to your neighbors when we create these refugia, if you will. And then they're like beads on a string, aren't they? And
Exactly.
it matters. Yeah. So thank you for that inspiration.
And I think it's not just it's not just, I don't, sometimes I think people think, well, it's just a band-aid. It's just a small thing that matters in that small little place. And I don't really think that a band-aid is that bad of a thing. I think it's better than nothing, for one thing. But I also think that, one of the things we know about the challenge of preserving biodiversity is that when populations of struggling species are isolated from one another, the gene pool gets very limited. So those corridors allow genes to pass from one small space to another small space and keeps the diversity stronger in a way that is not visible to the eye. It is if you're in the Smokies and you're keeping bear population genes very diverse by allowing passage from fragmented spot to fragmented spot. But it works with insects and it works with frogs and it works with rat snakes. It works with everything.
Yeah, exactly. The small matters. Yeah. And small matters. Let's talk about small people. I want to hear about the weedy garden. And for Walter, and for every child and for every parent reading it to them, this is the time of year when it seems like all of my friends are saying, "Oh, here at least where I live, oh, June, that is weed time, right?" Because everything is just burgeoning, and so I have an especial fondness for weeds, and I understand that you do too. um, so, could you tell us a little bit about your inspiration for the weedy garden? What is it that is so important about a weedy garden, especially for kids to know?
Um, well, I think you might have some of the same feelings about that. Your first picture book for children came out just in the last year also.
Yeah,
Um, so I think, yeah, I think that as the child in your story learns, it's 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 the world we belong in. I mean, I just think little people are, we're way up here above the garden. They're way down here close to the garden. So eye to eye with the bee, eye to eye with the garter snake. And so they are pat particularly well positioned to appreciate the weeds. Also, they don't know that this flower is supposed to be bad and this flower is supposed to be good. Children understand that all these flowers are beautiful. I do explain in the back of the book for the grown-ups, the parents, the teachers, the after-school caregivers, that I'm not really talking about. I do actually weed my garden. It's an everlasting challenge to keep the creeping Charlie out of there, and to the things that are invasive because they are still, even though not non-native, appealing to our native landscape. And so, I have so much monkey grass constantly coming up, and English ivy, and these things that come in sneakily underneath the leaf litter that has been covering them all fall and winter. But the good kind of weeds I'm talking about in the weedy garden are the ones, some of which I've planted and some of which the birds have brought and the wind has brought and the foxes have brought. But they have, like, I will have a stalk of tall ironweed appear out of nowhere at any given point in my yard. And it's a delight to discover these wildflowers, the ones that uh, our pioneer ancestors called weeds because they didn't look like the plants they knew from home, um, but that our native ancestors understood very well to be part of this wild world and the intricate interconnections of it. And so when you plant a garden or you allow a garden to flourish that's made up of milkweed and ironweed and goldenrod and asters and, oh, let's see, what else have we got? Coneflower and black-eyed Susans. All of those flowers, they're feeding the butterflies and the bees, and then they're feeding the birds, and then they're feeding um, everybody else. And so it's beautiful and useful. I think beautiful and useful. Beautiful alone now strikes me as not nearly enough. It has to be beautiful and good.
I think maybe the last thing that I wanted to say about venturing into children's books, and as you say, I too have had my first step into writing for children, and the excitement of working with an illustrator, and of course you got to work with your brother on that.
Mhm.
What was that symbiosis like? I'm so interested in your transition as well to writing for a younger audience.
Believe it or not, Robin, this was our goal, mine and Billy's, almost from the beginning. We're a year and a half apart in age, a year apart in school. And from the time, like, I would tell Billy stories even before I could write stories down. But as soon as I could write, he could draw long before I could write words. I would write them down and he would draw pictures around the margins and we'd give them to our parents or our grandparents for presents. We did this extraordinarily late in life. We were still doing it in grad school. We went to college together, we went to grad school together. I was always studying writing and he was always studying art. So he's been after me for a long time to write a picture book because he wanted to illustrate one. So partly this was about giving him a bigger canvas. He had done he's made original artworks for 52 of them for The Comfort of Crows and
Yeah.
about half that many for Late Migration. So we'd been doing this together within American publishing for the last almost decade. But this was the first time that his work was more important than mine. You could, as our editor said, you can have a picture book without words, but you can't have a picture book without pictures. So it was really wonderful to get to see what he could do with that larger canvas. And it is lush and beautiful and full of delights. I'd seen the artworks in progress for months, and and yet even so, in the finished book, when I held it in my hand, there were little creatures tucked in that weedy garden that I hadn't noticed that Billy had put there, and which is very much like the way it is for me to walk out to the garden itself and look at it and see who's in there, who's visiting today.
Yeah. And that lushness of with beings who really are in our gardens, I think helps to train all of our eyes to notice, right? To pay attention to those beings around us that kids are so good at, and we celebrate that and recognize, like, oh, I bet you've seen that and you want to see that.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
Well,
like
well,
Mary Oliver. You started with a quote from Mary Oliver. I think about her line where she says, I don't know how to pray. I do know how to pay attention. And and it is almost like a prayer.
In wonderful serendipity, Margaret, which is not surprising me, I wanted to close with a quote from Mary Oliver that seemed to me to be so aligned with the weedy garden. And it, of course, begins just as you said with this notion of paying attention. And she writes, we don't matter so much, but the children do. Show them daisies and the pale hepatica. Teach them the taste of sassafras and wintergreen, the lives of the blue sailors, mallow sunbursts, the moccasin flowers, and the frisky ones, inkberry, lamb's quarter, blueberries. Give them peppermint to put in their pockets as they go to school. Give them the fields and the woods and the possibility of the world salvaged from the lords of profit. Stand them in the stream, head them upstream, rejoice as they learn to love this green space they live in. And thank you. I think you have done exactly that. So
Well,
thank you for all of your work in shining a light on the world we live in and heading us all upstream.
and thank you for doing all those things and more, Robin. Thank you.
Thanks for a great visit.